They shared one husband, two sisters, who created the most endogamous lineage in American history. But this isn't just a story about forbidden love or twisted family bonds. This is about survival, desperation, and a pact so shocking that it would echo through generations, leaving a genetic legacy that still haunts bloodlines today. In 1878, in a small Midwestern town, sisters Clara and Magdalena Ruiz made a decision that would defy every moral code of their time. When Clara couldn't bear children, they agreed to something unthinkable. Magdalena would carry her brother-in-law's offspring, all while living under the same roof, sharing the same man, raising children who looked so eerily identical that neighbors whispered of dark magic. For decades, they maintained this impossible charade. The children thrived, brilliant and resilient, but bore the unmistakable marks of their tangled heritage. When those children grew up, they married their own cousins, keeping the bloodline pure, creating a web of genetics so tight that scientists today still study their descendants. But the sisters' secret came with a price. Magdalena's hidden journal reveals a woman torn between love and madness. Clara's Bible margins tell of prayers for forgiveness that never came. Town records speak of fires, scandals, and whispers of divine punishment that followed this family like a curse. The children born from this arrangement developed extraordinary traits: uncanny intelligence, shared mannerisms, identical faces across generations. Yet they also carried hidden burdens, mysterious illnesses, fractured minds, and the weight of a legacy built on forbidden ground. When a modern descendant discovers the truth in a dusty attic trunk, she uncovers not just family shame, but a testament to what people will do to survive when the world offers them nothing. What drives two sisters to share one husband? How far would you go to preserve your family line? And when love becomes survival, who pays the ultimate price? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Rain drummed against the attic window as Julia Calderon pulled another box from the shadows. Her grandmother's house felt different now, empty, echoing with decades of whispered secrets she was only beginning to understand. The weathered trunk sat in the corner like a sleeping animal, its brass clasps green with age. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed tissue paper, she found it. A photograph so faded the faces seemed to float like ghosts against the sepia background. Two women flanked a stern-faced man. Children clustered around them like flowers around a headstone, but it was their faces that stopped her breath. The resemblance wasn't just strong, it was impossible. Each child could have been carved from the same stone, sharing identical eyes, the same stub jawline, the same haunting smile. Julia held the photograph to the lamplight, studying the women, sisters, clearly, but something in their positioning unsettled her. They stood too close to the man, their hands resting on his shoulders with equal familiarity. The younger woman's eyes held a sadness that seemed to seep through the decades, while the elders stared at the camera with fierce determination. On the back, in faded ink, the Calderon family. 1892, Clara, Magdalena, Elias, and our children. Our children. Not Clara's children or Magdalena's children, but theirs. Together, Julia set the photograph on the desk beside her grandmother's lamp, its weak light casting dancing shadows across the mysterious faces. Something wasn't right about this picture, about these people who shared her blood. The children's faces haunted her. Too similar, too perfect, too strange. She had to know the truth. The whistle of the approaching train cut through the October morning as Elias Calderon stepped onto the platform at St. Augustine. His single leather satchel contained everything he owned now: a few clothes, his father's watch, and documents proving ownership of 40 acres outside town. The smell of wood smoke and horses filled the air, mixing with the scent of dying leaves. At 32, Elias carried grief like a weight in his chest. Mary had been dead 2 years now, claimed by fever in their cramped, Chicago tenement. The city had become a tomb after that, every street corner a reminder of their brief happiness. So, when the letter came from a land office about inherited property from a distant uncle, he'd packed without hesitation. The boarding house registry book felt heavy under his pen as he signed his name in careful script. Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor, studied him with curious eyes while handing over a brass key. Room 7, up the stairs. Meals are at 6, 8, and noon. No drinking, no cursing, and church on Sunday isn't required, but it's expected. Elias nodded, tucking the key into his vest pocket. Through the window, he could see the main street bustling with morning activity. Women in dark dresses hurried between shops, while men gathered outside the hardware store, their conversation a low rumble he couldn't quite catch. "You'll find the folks here friendly enough," Mrs. Patterson continued, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good Christian people, most of them. The Ruiz family runs a nice farm just outside town. 2 daughters helping their father since their mother passed. Fine girls, both of them." That afternoon, walking the dusty street toward the land office, Elias passed a white farmhouse set back from the road. 2 women worked in the garden, their heads bent over rows of late vegetables. One looked up as he passed, shading her eyes against the sun, and for a moment their gazes met across the yard. Something stirred in his chest, not quite hope, but not despair either. Clara knelt beside the bean rows, her calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency. At 26, she had run the Ruiz household since their mother's death 3 years ago. Every morning brought the same routine: milk the cows, gather eggs, prepare breakfast, tend the garden, cook dinner, mend clothes, prepare for the next day. Order was survival, and Clara had made herself its guardian. "Did you see him?" Magdalena's voice carried a flutter of excitement as she worked the soil nearby. At 23, Clara's younger sister still possessed the restless energy that age and responsibility had worn from Clara's bones. "I saw a man walking past," Clara replied without looking up. "Men walk past every day, not like him." Magdalena sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of dark hair from her forehead. "Mrs. Patterson says he's a widower from Chicago, owns the old Mendez property." Clara's hands stilled among the bean plants. The Mendez place had stood empty for 5 years, its windows dark and weeds claiming the yard. A working man with land meant possibilities, but Clara had learned to crush such thoughts before they could take root. "The land doesn't make a man good," she said finally. "Neither does being alone," Magdalena countered. "Father says he seems decent, quiet but respectful." That evening, Clara knelt beside her narrow bed, as she had every night since childhood. The wooden floor pressed hard against her knees while she folded her hands and closed her eyes. "Lord, grant me wisdom to see your will. If this man brings change to our lives, let it be according to your plan, not my desires." Through the thin wall, she could hear Magdalena humming while she brushed her hair, a sound of contentment that Clara envied more than she would ever admit. Change was coming, whether she prayed for wisdom or not. She could feel it in the air like the approach of a storm. Sunday morning found the Ruiz family in their usual pew, 3rd row from the front on the right side. Clara wore her one good dress, dark blue wool with small pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. Magdalena fidgeted beside her, occasionally craning her neck to look toward the back of the church. Father Miguel's sermon on the sanctity of marriage seemed to stretch longer than usual, his words about duty and devotion echoing off the whitewashed walls. Clara tried to focus on his message, but her attention kept drifting to the sound of footsteps behind her as latecomers found seats. When the service ended and they filed out into the bright October sun, their father struck up a conversation with Elias Calderon near the church steps. Up close, the stranger looked younger than Clara had expected, his dark hair showing only threads of silver at the temples. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of honest work. "Mr. Calderon, I'd like you to meet my daughters," their father said with the careful formality of a man arranging possibilities. "Clara, my eldest, and Magdalena." Elias removed his hat, revealing hair that curled slightly at the ends. "It's a pleasure to meet you both." His voice held traces of an accent Clara couldn't place, something soft and careful, like a man choosing his words with deliberate thought. "Father says you're taking over the Mendez property," Clara said, offering a slight nod. "With God's blessing, yes. The house needs work, but the land is Good. His eyes met hers briefly before shifting to include Magdalena in his attention. I hope to have crops planted by spring. Walking home after the introduction, Clara found herself studying the road ahead with new interest. The Mendez property lay just 2 miles from their farm, close enough for neighborly visits, close enough for a man to court a woman properly. That night, her prayers included a new request: clarity of heart. The church program from October 15, 1878, listed the Ruiz and Calderon names side by side in the attendance record, a small notation that would later seem prophetic. Within a month, Elias had become a regular presence at Sunday dinners, his quiet strength filling the spaces that had felt empty since Clara's mother died. He proved useful with his hands, repairing loose boards on the porch, fixing the gate that had sagged for months, even helping their father mend harness leather with the patience of a man accustomed to making things last. Clara watched him work from the kitchen window while preparing meals, noting how he measured twice before cutting, how he cleaned his tools before putting them away. "He's a good man," their father pronounced one evening after Elias had left. "Steady, responsible. A woman could do worse." But it was during their walks after Sunday dinner that Clara truly came to know him. Elias spoke little of his first wife, but what he shared painted a picture of deep loss. A young woman taken too soon, dreams of children that died with her. His grief had aged him, carved lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. "I never thought I'd want to try again," he told her one afternoon as they walked the path between their properties. "But St. Augustine feels like a place where a man could start over." Magdalena often joined these walks, trailing behind them like a younger sister determined not to be left out. She chattered about town gossip and asked Elias questions about Chicago that Clara would never have thought to voice. Her presence was a bright thread woven through their careful courtship, and Clara was grateful for it. The October evening when Elias took Clara's hand and asked her father for permission to marry, Magdalena stood in the kitchen doorway, her smile trembling between joy and something harder to name. The wedding certificate bore 3 signatures: Elias Calderon, Clara Ruiz, and Magdalena Ruiz as witness. Father Miguel performed the ceremony on a cold November morning with only immediate family present. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, while Magdalena stood beside her in pale yellow silk that made her look like captured sunlight. The reception was modest: ham and potatoes, fresh bread, and a cake. Magdalena had decorated with sugar roses. Neighbors filled the Ruiz parlor with conversation and well wishes, while the newlyweds accepted congratulations with nervous smiles. Clara noticed how Elias' hand trembled slightly when he placed the simple gold band on her finger, how his voice cracked when he promised to cherish her until death. That evening, they walked to the Mendez house that would now be their home. Elias had worked for weeks to make it habitable. New shutters, fresh whitewash, a kitchen garden already prepared for spring planting. Clara carried her few belongings in a carpet bag, while Magdalena helped transport bedding and dishes. "It's perfect," Clara whispered, standing in the doorway of what would be their bedroom. Elias had built new furniture, a bed frame, a wardrobe, even a small writing desk near the window. But it was at their first dinner as husband and wife that the arrangement truly began. Clara had set the table for 2. But when Magdalena knocked at the door just as they sat down to eat, Clara automatically set a 3rd place. "I brought preserves from home," Magdalena said, holding up a jar of blackberry jam. "And father thought you might want these." She produced a basket of eggs and fresh butter. Elias looked from one sister to the other, then smiled. "Of course you should join us. This feels more like family with you here." Magdalena took the chair across from them, her presence somehow completing a picture Clara hadn't known was unfinished. The small wooden cradle sat in the barn's darkest corner, covered now by horse blankets and the weight of Elias's failure. He'd carved it during the long winter evenings while Clara grew round with her first child, his hands shaping hope, into maple and pine. Every curve had been sanded smooth, every joint fitted with the precision of a man building his legacy. Clara had lost the baby in her 6th month. A son, the midwife said, perfect in every way except for the breath that never came. For 3 days afterward, Clara lay in their bed, staring at the ceiling, while Magdalena moved through the house like a ghost, cooking meals no one ate and tending chores with mechanical precision. Elias buried the cradle behind the barn on a gray March morning, the ground still frozen and resistant to his spade. Each shovelful of earth felt like another failure, another dream consigned to darkness. He worked alone, refusing help, as if the physical labor might exhaust the ache in his chest. When he returned to the house, he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with Magdalena's arms around her shoulders. Both women had been crying, Clara silently with the controlled grief of a woman accustomed to bearing pain, and Magdalena with the raw anguish of someone who loved without reservation. "We can try again," Elias said quietly, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Clara looked up at him with eyes that held no hope. "The midwife says my womb is damaged. There won't be children." The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't draw properly. Elias felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not just disappointment, but the terrible recognition that their marriage might become a hollow thing, built around an absence that would grow larger with each passing year. Magdalena's sob broke the silence, her tears falling onto Clara's dark hair like rain. The unsigned letter lay hidden in Elias's desk drawer, written in his careful script but never sent to his brother. Published in Chicago. "The situation here has become complicated," it read. "Clara cannot bear children, but we have found a solution that defies conventional thinking. Her sister Magdalena has agreed to help us build the family we desperately need. I know this arrangement would shock you, but survival in these circumstances requires choices that civilization might not understand." The letter had remained unfinished for good reason. How could he explain the desperation that had driven them to this decision? How could he describe the evening when Clara, her face pale but determined, had made her impossible suggestion? It had been a Sunday in late April, 6 months after the miscarriage. They sat in their parlor after dinner, the weight of their childless future pressing down like storm clouds. Magdalena was there, as she often was, mending one of Clara's torn aprons, while the silence stretched between them. "I've been thinking," Clara said suddenly, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was about to propose, "about the scriptures, about Abraham and Sarah." Elias looked up from his Bible, confused by the reference. "Sarah gave her handmaid Hagar to Abraham when she couldn't bear children," Clara continued, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. "The child was considered Sarah's own." The implications settled slowly, like sediment in still water. Magdalena's needle stopped moving, her face flushing deep red as she understood her sister's meaning. "Clara, no," Magdalena whispered. That's not possible." "It is possible," Clara replied with the firmness of a woman who had thought through every objection. "You're unmarried. Your family, the child would have our blood, would carry the Calderon name." Elias felt his world tilting on its axis. The suggestion was scandalous, potentially criminal, certainly sinful by any conventional measure, but it was also logical in its desperate way, a solution born of love and necessity rather than lust. "What about the town, the church?" he managed to ask. "No one needs to know the truth," Clara said. "We'll be discreet, careful. When the time comes, I'll claim the child as mine." Magdalena stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back again. "I can't. I won't. It's wrong." But Clara reached for her sister's hand, holding it with gentle firmness. "You've lived in this house with us for months. You've helped tend our home, shared our meals, been more wife than sister to both of us already. This would just make it official." The three of them sat in candlelit silence while the full weight of the proposal settled around them. Outside, spring peepers sang in the evening darkness, their voices carrying promises of renewal and growth. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If we do this, there can be no going back. We would all be bound by this secret until death." Clara nodded solemnly. Magdalena, tears streaming down her cheeks, finally whispered her agreement. The pact was sealed, not with signatures or ceremonies, but with clasped hands around the dinner table, as the candle burned low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to bless their unholy alliance. The birth record filed with St. Augustine County listed Clara Calderon as mother to Rafael Miguel Calderon, born September 15, 1879. The lie was written in official ink, signed by a midwife who knew better than to ask difficult questions about the timing of pregnancies, or the ways that desperate families arrange their survival. Clara had worn padding during Magdalena's pregnancy, appearing in town just often enough to maintain the illusion, while her sister hid in their farmhouse. When labor began, Clara sent for the midwife with trembling hands, then spent 18 hours pacing the kitchen, while Magdalena struggled in the bedroom that had become their shared sanctuary of secrets. The baby's first cry cut through the September dawn like a knife through silk, sharp, clear, and impossibly beautiful. Clara rushed to the bedside where Magdalena lay exhausted and bleeding, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. "He's perfect," the midwife announced, placing the red-faced infant in Clara's waiting arms. "Strong lungs, good weight, you've been blessed." Clara looked down at the child, Elias' son, Magdalena's blood, her own desperate hope made flesh, and felt her heart crack open with a love so fierce it frightened her. His tiny fingers curled around her thumb with surprising strength, while his dark eyes, already focusing with unusual alertness, seemed to recognize her fate. "Raphael," she whispered, the name they had chosen together. "My son." From the bed, Magdalena watched with tears streaming down her cheeks. The midwife bustled about, cleaning and packing her supplies, completely unaware that she was witnessing the culmination of the most elaborate deception St. Augustine had ever seen. That evening, neighbors came to congratulate the new parents, bringing gifts of food and baby clothes. Clara accepted their good wishes with gracious smiles, while Magdalena, officially the doting aunt, helped serve coffee and cake in the parlor. Only when the last visitor had gone did the three of them sit together in the nursery, watching Raphael sleep in the cradle Elias had rescued from the barn and lovingly restored. The baby's breathing was soft and regular, a sound that filled the silence between them with something approaching peace. "He's ours," Clara said finally, her voice barely audible. "All of ours." The market receipt from Jacobson's general store told its own story in two distinct handwritings. Clara's careful script listing flour, sugar, and thread, while Magdalena's flowing letters requested ribbons, soap, and treats for the children. By 1885, the Calderon household had grown to include 5 children, whose resemblance sparked whispered conversations throughout St. Augustine. Raphael was joined by twin daughters in 1881, Maria and Carmen, born to Magdalena but claimed by Clara, with the same elaborate deception. 2 more boys followed, Diego in 1883 and Miguel in 1885, their births timed carefully to maintain the illusion that Clara was extraordinarily fertile, while Magdalena remained the devoted spinster aunt. The children thrived under their unusual arrangement, bright and healthy, with an uncanny similarity that went beyond typical family resemblance. They shared not just Elias's dark eyes and strong jaw, but identical mannerisms, the way they tilted their heads when thinking, their habit of speaking in overlapping sentences, even their preference for the same foods and games. It's remarkable How much they favor each other, Mrs. Patterson observed during one of her visits, studying the children as they played in the yard. Almost like they're cut from the same cloth. Clara smiled tightly while pouring tea, aware of how the woman's eyes lingered on each child's face. Strong family traits, she replied. The Calderon blood runs true. But the neighbor's curiosity was becoming harder to deflect. Children at school asked uncomfortable questions about why the Calderon cousins looked more like siblings. Shopkeepers made pointed comments about the timing of births. Even Father Miguel seemed to regard their family with increasing suspicion during Sunday services. The whispers followed them everywhere. At the market, after church, during town gatherings. Women would lower their voices when Clara approached, then resume their conversations with pointed glances. Men would nod politely to Elias, but exchange meaningful looks when they thought he wasn't watching. The secret was becoming impossible to contain, pressing against the boundaries of their carefully constructed lie like water against a failing dam. Magdalena's hidden journal lay beneath loose floorboards in her bedroom, its pages filled with the torment of a woman caught between love and despair. Her handwriting, usually so flowing and confident, became jagged and desperate as the years passed and the weight of their deception grew unbearable. June 15, 1885, one entry read, Clara held Miguel today while he took his first steps, and I watched from the doorway like a stranger in my own life. He is my son, my blood, my body's gift to this world. But I am nothing to him except Aunt Magdalena, who brings sweets and tells stories. How long can a heart break before it simply stops? The pages revealed a woman slowly fragmenting under the strain of their arrangement. Magdalena wrote of sleepless nights when she would slip into the nursery just to touch her children's faces while they slept. She described the agony of watching Clara comfort crying babies who instinctively turned to her for solace. Most painful of all, she documented the growing distance between herself and Elias, how their shared guilt had poisoned even their stolen moments of intimacy. He comes to my room like a man visiting a grave, she wrote. There is no joy in our coupling anymore, only the mechanical hope for another child to give away. I have become a broodmare in my own sister's stable, and she tends me with the same mixture of gratitude and disgust she would show any useful animal. The journal also revealed Magdalena's growing awareness of the children's unusual development. They spoke earlier than normal children, walked with uncanny coordination, and displayed an intelligence that bordered on unsettling. More disturbing still, they seemed to communicate with each other in ways that transcended normal sibling bonds, finishing each other's thoughts, sharing dreams, even feeling each other's physical pain. They are beautiful and strange, Magdalena wrote, like flowers blooming in cursed soil. What have we created? What will become of children born from such deception? The final entry, dated simply 1885, consisted of a single line written in tears that had smeared the ink. I am both wife and shadow. The church meeting minutes from August 3, 1885, recorded the concerns of several prominent church members regarding irregularities in the Calderon household that require pastoral attention. Elder Morrison, who owned the largest farm in the county, had brought the matter before the church council with the solemnity of a man accustomed to moral authority. There's something unnatural about that family, Morrison declared during the meeting held in the church basement. 5 children in 6 years, all born to a woman who was supposedly barren, and that sister living with them like some kind of concubine. Father Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, aware of the dangerous territory they were entering. Accusations of impropriety could destroy lives in a community where reputation was everything. Yet he couldn't deny his own growing suspicions about the Calderon arrangement. We must be careful not to bear false witness, he cautioned. The Calderons are regular church members, generous contributors, and the children are well-behaved. Too well-behaved. Interrupted Mrs. Jacobson from the general store. Have you seen how they move together? Like a flock of birds turning all at once. It's not natural. Elder Morrison leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. I'm not saying they're evil people, Father. I'm saying something's not right, and it's our duty to address it before it corrupts the whole community. The discussion continued for 2 hours, with various members sharing their observations and concerns. Mrs. Patterson mentioned Magdalena's frequent visits to the doctor in the neighboring town, always returning with a mysterious sadness. The school teacher noted how the Calderon children seemed to know things they shouldn't know, answering questions before they were fully asked. When the meeting ended, Father Miguel was tasked with approaching Elias directly. The confrontation came the following Sunday after service, when the priest asked Elias to remain behind for a private conversation. The community has concerns, Father Miguel said carefully, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. About your household arrangements, about the children. Elias felt his blood turn cold, but kept his expression neutral. What kind of concerns? People talk, Elias. They wonder about your sister-in-law's prolonged residence in your home. They question the timing of your wife's pregnancies. The accusation hung in the church air like incense smoke. Elias met the priest's gaze steadily, calling upon every ounce of dignity he possessed. My wife and her sister are close. Magdalena helps with the children in the household. There's nothing improper about family supporting family. And the children's resemblance to each other, the unusual intensity of their familial bonds. Strong blood runs in strong families, Father. Surely that's a blessing, not a curse. Father Miguel studied Elias's face for a long moment, searching for cracks in his composure. Finding none, he finally nodded. I pray that's all it is, my son, for all your sakes. The torn fragment of a love letter, discovered years later pressed between the pages of Magdalena's prayer book, revealed the depth of her desperation. My dearest M, your kindness has been a light in my darkness. When I think of your gentle touch, your understanding heart, I dream of a different life where love is simple and true. Perhaps when I return in the spring. The traveling merchant arrived in St. Augustine every autumn, his wagon loaded with fabrics, spices, and exotic goods from distant cities. Thomas Brennan was handsome in a worldly way that contrasted sharply with the rough farmers and shopkeepers of their small town. His easy smile and cultured voice spoke of education and adventure, things Magdalena had never known but yearned for with desperate hunger. Their affair began innocently. A longer conversation at his wagon, a shared laugh over some trinket from Chicago, a compliment about her dress that made her blush like a schoolgirl. But loneliness and frustration had made Magdalena vulnerable to his practiced charm, and what started as harmless flirtation quickly became something more dangerous. The first kiss happened behind the barn on an October evening, when she'd gone to gather eggs after dark. Thomas had followed her, claiming he wanted to discuss a special order of silk thread. But his intentions became clear when he pulled her into the shadows and pressed his mouth to hers with desperate hunger. You're wasted here, he whispered against her neck. A woman like you should be living in a real city, wearing beautiful clothes, attending theaters and concerts. For a few stolen moments, Magdalena allowed herself to imagine such a life. Freedom from the suffocating weight of their family secret, escaped from the role of perpetual shadow in her sister's marriage. But guilt crashed over her like cold water when she remembered her children sleeping in the house nearby. Elias discovered the affair when he found Thomas's wagon parked too long behind their barn and went to investigate. The sight of his sister-in-law in another man's arms triggered a rage so profound it surprised him with its intensity. Get away from my property, he told Tomas with deadly calm. If I see you near my family again, I'll kill you. The merchant stammered apologies and excuses before fleeing into the night, leaving Magdalena to face Elias's wrath alone. But it was Clara's reaction that cut deepest. Not anger, but disappointment so profound it seemed to drain the color from her face. "How could you?" Clara whispered. "After everything we've built, everything we've sacrificed?" The insurance claim filed after the barn fire detailed losses totaling $847.00, 12 head of cattle, winter feed stores, farm equipment, and structural damage that left the building a blackened skeleton against the autumn sky. But the document couldn't capture the terror that gripped the family as they watched their livelihood burn, or the moment when 6-year-old Raphael disappeared into the smoke-filled structure to save a trapped calf. The fire started just after sunset on October 15, 1885, when a lantern overturned in the hayloft. Magdalena saw the first orange glow through the kitchen window and screamed for help, her voice cutting through the evening quiet like a knife. Elias and Clara rushed from the house to find flames already climbing the barn walls with terrifying speed. The next few minutes became a blur of shouting and desperate action. Elias threw open the barn doors and began leading panicked animals to safety while Clara pumped water from the well, filling buckets that seemed pitifully small against the growing inferno. Magdalena herded the younger children away from the danger, counting heads frantically in the flickering light. "Where's Raphael?" Clara screamed over the roar of flames. That's when they saw him, a small figure silhouetted against the burning doorway, struggling to pull a terrified calf toward safety. The roof beams were already groaning overhead, showering sparks like deadly snow. Elias plunged into the smoke without hesitation, his lungs burning as he fought his way to his eldest son. He found Raphael collapsed near the calf, overcome by smoke inhalation, his small body limp and frighteningly still. Elias scooped up the boy and stumbled toward the door, just as a section of roof crashed down behind them. Dr. Hanley worked through the night to save Raphael's life, forcing water and honey down his throat, while the boy's chest rattled with each labored breath. The other children huddled together in the parlor, their faces streaked with soot and tears as they listened to their brother's struggles. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins, and Raphael was breathing easier. Though his voice would remain hoarse for weeks, the family stood in their yard surveying the destruction, the smell of charred wood and death heavy in the lake, the air. Neighbors began arriving with the sunrise, bringing food and offers of help, but Elias noticed how some of them looked at the ruins with satisfaction rather than sympathy, as if the fire confirmed their suspicions about divine judgment. The town council resolution, officially recorded in the municipal ledger on November 2, 1885, declared that moral irregularities within certain households may have contributed to recent misfortunes, and the community must take steps to ensure that Christian values are upheld and protected. The language was careful, legally defensible, but everyone knew it targeted the Calderons directly. Elder Morrison stood before the hastily assembled crowd in the church sanctuary, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to moral leadership. Behind him, the other council members sat in judgment like a tribunal, their faces grave with righteous purpose. "We've all seen the signs," Morrison declared, his eyes sweeping over the packed pews. "Unnatural family arrangements, children who resemble each other too closely, a household where the lines between marriage and other relationships have become blurred." Murmurs rippled through the congregation as neighbors exchanged meaningful glances. In the front row, the Calderon family sat in stony silence, Elias with his jaw clenched, Clara holding baby Miguel protectively, and Magdalena staring at her folded hands as accusations swirled around them. "The fire was a warning," Morrison continued, his voice rising with evangelical fervor. "God's judgment on those who mock the sanctity of Christian marriage. We cannot allow such corruption to spread through our community like a plague." Mrs. Jacobson stood to support the elder's words. "My own children have come home with questions about the Calderon household that no Christian child should have to ask. There's something unwholesome there, something that goes against nature itself." The crowd grew restless, voices rising as various members shared their suspicions and concerns. The Calderon children pressed closer to their parents, sensing the hostility even if they didn't understand its source. Finally, Clara rose to her feet with the dignity of a queen facing execution. The sanctuary fell silent as she surveyed the faces of people she'd known for years, neighbors who'd shared her table and accepted her hospitality. "You speak of God's judgment," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the church, "but I see only the judgment of small minds and smaller hearts. My family has done nothing but survive in a world that offers women few choices and fewer mercies." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd like a challenge thrown at their feet. "We are not sinners," she continued with chilling calm. "We are survivors. And if that threatens you, perhaps you should examine your own consciences instead of condemning ours." The piece of torn fabric discovered years later beneath Magdalena's bed came from the blue cotton dress she'd worn the night everything finally broke apart. The violent confrontation began in the kitchen after the children had been put to bed, when years of suppressed resentment and accumulated grief finally exploded into the open. "This has to stop," Magdalena said, her voice shaking with exhaustion. "The whole town knows. The children are asking questions I can't answer. We're living a lie that's poisoning everyone it touches." Clara stood at the sink washing dinner dishes, her movements sharp and angry. "Lower your voice. The children will hear." "The children already know." Magdalena's voice cracked with desperation. "Maria asked me yesterday why she looks more like me than you. Diego wants to know why he calls you mother but feels safer with me." "They're not stupid, Clara. They see what we've done to ourselves." "What we've done?" Clara whirled around, water dripping from her hands onto the wooden floor. "What we've done is survive. What we've done is build a family when God seemed determined to deny us one. What we've done is exactly what had to be done." "No." Magdalena slammed her fist on the table, making the salt cellar jump. "What we've done is turn me into your broodmare and those children into your property. I gave birth to them, I nursed them, I love them with every fiber of my being, but they're not allowed to be mine." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Clara's face went white with rage and something that might have been guilt. "They were never yours," Clara said with deadly quiet. "You were helping me, helping us. You knew that from the beginning." "I was 19 years old and desperate to please you," Magdalena screamed. "I didn't know what I was agreeing to. I didn't know it would feel like dying a little bit every day." Their voices had risen beyond caution now, and both women could hear movement upstairs as the children woke to their mother's battle. Clara lunged forward and grabbed Magdalena's dress, her fingers twisting in the blue fabric. "You think I don't know what this costs?" Clara hissed through gritted teeth. "You think I don't see the way they look at you? You think I don't lie awake wondering if they love me at all, or if they just accept me because they have no choice?" The fabric tore as Magdalena wrenched away, leaving Clara holding a strip of cotton like evidence of their destruction. The empty whiskey bottle discovered under Elias's bed told its own story of a man drowning in guilt and alcohol. By winter 1885, he'd begun drinking heavily, starting each morning with a shot of bourbon for the cold and ending each day unconscious at his desk, his head pillowed on account books that no longer made sense. The weight of their secret had broken something fundamental in Elias's character. The man who'd once prided himself on steady hands and clear thinking now stumbled through days in an alcoholic haze, avoiding his reflection in windows and mirrors because he couldn't bear to see what he'd become. Clara found him one morning passed out in the barn, lying in the straw beside an empty bottle with frost coating his hair and beard. She'd stood over him for a long time, studying the face that had once represented hope and security, now slack with drink and failure. "Get up," she said finally, her voice cutting through his stupor like ice water. "The children need to see their father standing on his own feet." Elias opened bloodshot eyes and tried to focus on her face. "Clara, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of this. Sorry doesn't milk cows or mend fences or put food on the table," she replied, but her voice held weariness rather than anger. "Sorry doesn't give those children a father they can respect." Magdalena had retreated into her own form of escape. Long walks alone, hours spent staring out windows, days when she barely spoke to anyone. She moved through the house like a ghost, tending her duties mechanically while something vital inside her withered and died. The children sensed the deterioration in their adult world, even if they couldn't understand its cause. They began to cling together more tightly, creating their own circle of security as their parents' world fell apart around them. Raphael, now 7, took on responsibilities far beyond his years, helping his younger siblings with their lessons and mediating their disputes with unnatural maturity. Despite the fracture between the adults, necessity still bound them together. Cows needed milking, meals required cooking, and the children demanded care, regardless of their parents' emotional collapse. Clara shouldered most of these burdens alone, her spine straight and her face set with determination that had hardened into something resembling granite. Late at night, when the house finally fell quiet, she would sometimes hear Magdalena crying through the thin walls. Soft, hopeless sobs that spoke of dreams dying by inches. Clara never went to comfort her sister anymore. Some wounds, she'd learned, were too deep for healing. The cousin marriage license dated June 15, 1897, officially joined Rafael Calderon to his second cousin Carmen Ruiz, maintaining the family's commitment to keeping their bloodline pure while providing legal cover for what had become an increasingly obvious pattern. By then, the first generation of their unusual experiment had reached adulthood, and their resemblance to each other had only grown more pronounced with age. Raphael stood tall and straight in his wedding suit, his dark eyes holding the same intensity that marked all the Calderon children. At 18, he possessed an unusual gravity that made him seem older than his years, as if the weight of family secrets had aged him prematurely. Carmen, his bride, looked so similar they could have been twins separated by a few years, rather than cousins preparing to wed. Clara watched the ceremony with fierce pride, seeing her careful planning come to fruition. The marriage would keep their land consolidated, their bloodline strong, and their secrets safely contained within the family circle. What outsiders saw as unnatural, she viewed as practical, a logical solution to the problems of inheritance and identity that had always plagued their kind. "It's beautiful," Magdalena whispered, standing beside Clara in the church pew. At 34, she'd never married, dedicating herself instead to helping raise the growing collection of Calderon children. Her face showed the wear of years spent in emotional exile, but today she smiled with genuine happiness for the young couple. The wedding feast brought the entire extended family together in a rare moment of public celebration. Neighbors attended out of curiosity as much as courtesy, their eyes tracking the familiar faces around the table with barely concealed fascination. The resemblance between family members was so strong it seemed to mock the very idea of genetic diversity. "Like looking at the same person at different ages," Mrs. Patterson murmured to her companion, studying the gathering with anthropological interest. As the evening progressed and alcohol loosened tongues, the conversations grew more pointed. Several guests made comments about keeping in the family, and blood staying pure, their words carrying undertones of both admiration and unease. But the young couple seemed oblivious to the whispers, lost in their own joy and the promise of continuing their family's unique legacy. The unfinished confession letter, written in Magdalena's increasingly shaky handwriting, lay hidden beneath her mattress like a guilty secret waiting for discovery. Dated simply 1898, it began with the desperate words of a woman finally ready to speak her truth. "My dearest children, there are things you must know before I leave this world. Truths that have been buried too long in the shadows of our family's survival." At 35, Magdalena had begun to fail in ways that went beyond simple aging. The doctor from the county seat spoke of nervous exhaustion and recommended rest, but Clara recognized the symptoms of a woman slowly dissolving under the weight of a life lived in the margins of her own story. Magdalena spent her days sitting by the parlor window, watching the children she'd borne play in the yard while calling another woman mother. Her hands had developed a tremor that made sewing impossible, and she often forgot to eat unless Clara brought her meals on a tray. The weight of secrets, Dr. Hindley told Clara during one of his visits, can be as deadly as any physical ailment. Some burdens are simply too heavy for the human spirit to carry indefinitely. The confession letter discovered after Magdalena's collapse revealed the full extent of her torment. "I have been mother and stranger, lover and exile, sister and rival all at once. The children who carry my blood call me aunt, while my heart breaks a little more each day. Clara means well, but she has never understood that sharing a husband is greater than sharing children. Every kiss they give her is stolen from me." The letter went on to detail the arrangement that had created their family, the pain of watching her children grow up believing lies about their parentage, and her growing certainty that the strange similarities between the children went beyond normal family traits. "There is something unnatural in our blood now," she wrote. "Something we have created through our desperation. The children are too alike, too connected. Sometimes I watch them and wonder if we have made something wonderful or something terrible." The letter remained unfinished, ending mid-sentence as if the effort of confession had finally overwhelmed her remaining strength. The death certificate dated March 3, 1899 listed Elias Calderon's cause of death as complications from pneumonia, but those who knew him understood that alcohol and despair had killed him long before his lungs finally failed. Clara stood beside his grave in her black mourning dress, dry-eyed and straight-backed, while their children wept for a father who had become a ghost years before his actual death. At 41, Clara found herself alone in ways she'd never expected. The arrangement that had once seemed so practical now left her isolated even from her own sister, who had grown increasingly fragile and distant. Magdalena attended the funeral like a sleepwalker, her face vacant and her responses to condolences automatic. The house felt different without Elias's presence. Not emptier, exactly, since he'd been absent in spirit for years, but somehow more final. Clara began sleeping in the guest room rather than the bedroom they'd shared, unable to bear the weight of memories that bed contained. Neighbors came to offer condolences and assistance, but their offers felt hollow, tainted by years of suspicion and gossip. Mrs. Patterson brought a casserole and stayed for coffee, but Claire noticed how the woman's eyes cataloged the children's faces as if collecting evidence for future conversations. "You'll be needing help now," Elder Morrison said after the burial, his voice carrying the false concern of a man offering charity with conditions. "A widow woman with so many children, it's not natural for a family to be so isolated." Clara met his gaze steadily, reading the implied threat beneath his words. The community would help, but only if she accepted their judgment and their version of moral order. "We'll manage," she replied with the dignity of a woman who had learned to survive on her own terms. "We always have." That night she sat in Elias's chair for the first time since his death, holding baby Miguel, now 14 and nearly grown, while the other children gathered around her feet. They looked to her with complete trust, unaware of how precarious the world had become. The rosary beads clutched in Magdalena's final moments were worn smooth from decades of desperate prayer, their silver chain dark with the oils of countless pleas for forgiveness, understanding, and peace. She died on a gray February morning in 1901, her breath simply stopping as she slept, as if her exhausted spirit had finally accepted its release. Clara found her at dawn, lying still and pale in the narrow bed she'd occupied for 23 years of exile in her own family's home. Magdalena's face looked younger in death, the lines of worry and suppressed longing smoothed away to reveal something approaching serenity. "She's free now," Clara whispered to the empty room, but the words felt inadequate to encompass the magnitude of her sister's sacrifice. For over 2 decades, Magdalena had lived as a shadow, loving children she couldn't claim, sharing a man who belonged to someone else, carrying secrets that had slowly poisoned her from within. The funeral was small and quiet, attended by family and a few neighbors who came out of courtesy rather than genuine grief. Father Miguel spoke of eternal rest and divine mercy, but his words seemed to echo hollowly in the nearly empty church. Magdalena had been too much of an enigma in life to generate much mourning and death. The children wept with the pure grief of those too young to understand the complexities that had shaped their aunt's existence. To them, she had simply been the gentle presence who told stories, mended clothes, and slipped them extra cookies when Clara wasn't looking. They would never know the depth of love she'd carried for them in silence. Clara stood at the graveside alone after the others had gone, studying the simple wooden cross that marked her sister's resting place. The winter wind cut through her coat, but she remained motionless, trying to find words for a farewell that was 20 years overdue. "We did what we had to," she finally whispered, the same words she'd spoken in moments of doubt throughout their arrangement. But standing there in the cemetery's silence, they sounded less like justification than like an apology. The family tree diagram, drawn in Clara's careful hand and hidden in her Bible, revealed the intricate web of relationships that had grown from their desperate pact. Lines connected cousins to cousins, second cousins to third cousins, creating a pattern so complex and self-contained that it resembled a mathematical equation more than a traditional family structure. By 1905, Clara had overseen the marriages of all 5 first-generation children. Raphael married Carmen, Maria wed her cousin Luis, the son of their neighbors who had been drawn into the family through carefully arranged magic. Courtships, and the twins Diego and Miguel had taken wives from the extended Ruiz cousins who lived in the next county. Each union had been planned with the precision of a chess master, designed to strengthen their bloodline while maintaining the appearance of normal family expansion. The children born from these cousin marriages showed even more pronounced similarities than their parents. Clara's grandchildren were so alike that visitors often mistook them for siblings, despite being born to different parents. They shared not just physical traits, but uncanny behavioral patterns. Identical preferences in food, simultaneous reactions to weather changes, and an almost telepathic ability to anticipate each other's thoughts and actions. "It's like they share one mind spread across multiple bodies," Dr. Henley observed during a rare visit to examine a sick child. His medical training had given him words for what the townspeople could only describe as unnatural. But Clara saw only strength in their unusual unity. These children were smarter than average, more resilient, more capable of surviving hardship than their peers. When other families struggled with crop failures or harsh winters, the Calderons thrived through their collective resourcefulness and shared labor. The outside world might whisper about their strangeness, but Clara had built something that would endure long after conventional families had scattered to the winds. She had created a legacy that would carry their blood forward through generations, each marriage carefully chosen to preserve what they'd built while strengthening what they'd become. The margins of Clara's Bible, filled with her handwritten reflections over decades of reading and prayer, revealed a woman wrestling with questions of sin, survival, and divine judgment. Her notes traced a spiritual journey from desperate justification to something approaching peace, though doubt never entirely left her words. Genesis 33, she had written beside the story of Rachel and her handmaid Bilhah. What God permits for some, he may permit for all. Survival requires choices that comfort does not understand. Later entries showed less certainty. Leviticus 18:18, neither shall you take a wife to her sister to vex her. Did I vex Magdalena unto death? At 68, Clara had become the undisputed matriarch of a family that now numbered 37 members across 3 generations. Her hair had turned completely white, and arthritis had bent her fingers, but her will remained as strong as iron. She ruled family gatherings with quiet authority, deciding which children would marry whom, which plots of land would be divided how, which family stories would be preserved, and which would be forgotten. The youngest generation of children gathered around her chair during Sunday dinners, listening to carefully edited tales of their family's early days. Clara had become the keeper of their mythology, transforming their scandalous origins into a story of pioneer resilience and family loyalty. "Tell us about Great-Aunt Magdalena," little Sarah would ask, and Clara would speak of a devoted sister who helped raise the children after their mother's difficult pregnancies. The truth lay buried beneath layers of protective fiction, known only to Clara and the fading memories of neighbors too polite or too tired to contradict the family's official version of events. Some nights, alone in her room with only the flickering candlelight for company, Clara would read her Bible and wonder if God had truly blessed their arrangement or if their prosperity was simply the reward for determination and careful planning. "We endured," she wrote in her final margin note. "That must count for something in the ledger of heaven." The complete confession letter, discovered by Julia decades later in the attic trunk, finally revealed the full truth that Magdalena had tried to leave for her children. Written in her final months, it began where her earlier attempt had ended, detailing not just the arrangement between the sisters, but the growing strangeness she'd observed in their offspring. "My beloved children," the letter read, "by the time you find this, I will be beyond the reach of your anger or forgiveness, but the truth can no longer be contained. You are not Clara's children, though she has loved you as her own. You are mine, born of a desperate pact between sisters who saw no other path to survival." The letter went on to describe the early years of their deception, the careful coordination required to maintain their lie, and the emotional cost of watching her biological children grow up calling another woman mother. But it was the final section that proved most disturbing, detailing observations that Magdalena had kept to herself out of fear. "You are connected in ways that go beyond normal family bonds," she wrote. "I have watched you share dreams, feel each other's pain across distances, know things you should not know." When Raphael broke his arm at age 6, Maria cried out in pain though she was miles away. When Carmen developed fever, Diego became ill the same day with identical symptoms, though they had not seen each other in weeks. The confession revealed Magdalena's growing belief that their inbreeding had created something unprecedented. A family so genetically intertwined that the boundaries between individual consciousness had begun to blur. "I fear we have made you into something wonderful and terrible," the letter concluded. "You are brilliant beyond your years, resilient beyond normal human endurance, but you are also bound to each other in ways that may never allow you true independence. I pray that love will prove stronger than the strangeness we have bred into your blood." The letter was signed simply, "Your mother, Magdalena," in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky toward the end. The bouquet of fresh wildflowers Julia left at the old cemetery spoke of acceptance rather than judgment. Their bright colors a stark contrast to the weathered headstones that marked the graves of Elias, Clara, and Magdalena. Standing there in the afternoon sun, Julia felt the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a legacy she was finally ready to understand. The revelation of her family's true history had taken weeks to fully absorb. The genetic testing she'd ordered out of curiosity had revealed exactly what Magdalena's letter predicted. Julia carried markers indicating significant inbreeding in her family line, patterns so pronounced that the laboratory had called to verify the samples weren't contaminated, but rather than horror, Julia felt a strange sense of completion. The unusual traits that ran through her family, the uncanny intelligence, the shared intuition, the way they could anticipate each other's thoughts during family gatherings, finally made sense. They weren't supernatural gifts or curses, but the natural result of genetic concentration, the same principle that created champion racehorses or purebred dogs. "You did what you had to do," she said aloud, addressing the 3 graves as if their occupants could hear her. "You survived when survival seemed impossible. You built something that lasted." The modern world might judge their choices harshly, but Julia understood the desperation that had driven them. In an era when unmarried women had few options and childless wives faced social exile, Clara and Magdalena had found a solution that defied convention but served necessity. Walking back to her car, Julia felt the presence of her ancestors, not as ghosts haunting her bloodline, but as pioneers who had charted an impossible course through circumstances that would have destroyed lesser people. Their story wasn't a scandal to be hidden, but a testament to the lengths people would go to preserve love and build legacy. The photograph and letter would go back into the attic trunk, but the truth would no longer be a source of shame. It would simply be their story, strange, difficult, but ultimately human.